A little girl about to make a heartbreaking decision calls to say goodbye, but a CEO answers. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type "Amen" in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The morning sun painted Seattle's skyline in shades of gold, but inside the cramped studio apartment on Pine Street, darkness seemed to cling to every corner. 7-year-old Madison carefully adjusted the purple sling across her small chest, making sure her 3-year-old sister Grace was secure and comfortable. The worn fabric, once a vibrant royal purple, had faded to the color of old bruises, much like the ones that occasionally appeared on their mother's arms. "Maddie, breakfast," Rebecca's voice carried from the kitchenette, though they all knew there wasn't much to offer. The blonde woman, barely 34 but looking older from the weight of constant worry, stood stirring watery oatmeal in a dented pot. Her hair, once the envy of every woman in her high school, now hung limp around her shoulders, and her blue eyes had lost their sparkle years ago. Trevor sprawled across the threadbare couch, remote control in one hand and an empty beer bottle in the other, despite it being only 9 in the morning. At 36, he possessed the kind of laziness that had become an art form. His unemployment benefits had run out months ago, but he showed no signs of looking for work. "This tastes like water," he complained, pushing away the bowl Rebecca had prepared for him. "Can't you make anything decent in this dump?" Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she set down the spoon. "Trevor, please. The girls need to eat something before..." "Before what? Before you drag them around the city begging for handouts again?" His voice rose and little Grace whimpered against Madison's chest. "Maybe if you actually tried to find a real job instead of whatever charity work you think you're doing." Madison had heard this argument countless times. Her mother worked 3 part-time jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving at a diner during lunch rushes, and doing alterations for a small tailor shop on weekends. But Trevor seemed to believe that anything less than a CEO position wasn't worth his time, conveniently ignoring the fact that he lacked both education and ambition. "I'm doing my best," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your best?" Trevor laughed bitterly. "Your best would be finding someone who can actually provide for this family. These kids aren't even mine. Well, except for the baby there." He gestured dismissively at Grace. "That one's mine, but the older one. She's just another mouth to feed." Madison felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd always known Trevor wasn't her real father, but hearing him say it so casually, so cruelly, cut deeper than she expected. Grace was Trevor's daughter, but Madison. She belonged to someone else entirely, someone her mother never talked about. "Don't talk about Maddie like that," Rebecca said, finding a spark of defiance. "She's a good girl and she helps more than you do." Trevor's face darkened. "Don't you dare compare that kid to me. I'm the man of this house." Madison quietly slipped out the front door, Grace still sleeping peacefully in the sling. She'd heard enough. At 7 years old, she understood more than adults realized. She knew her mother worked until her feet bled. She knew Trevor ate most of their food while they scraped together leftovers. She knew they were slowly drowning, and nobody was coming to save them. The autumn air was crisp as Madison walked down Pine Street, her small hand trailing along the chain-link fence that separated the sidewalk from the harbor below. Other children her age were probably getting ready for school, eating real breakfast, wearing clean clothes. Madison hadn't been to school in weeks. Rebecca couldn't afford new uniforms, and Trevor had forbidden her from taking charity from the school district. "Where are we going, Maddie?" Grace mumbled sleepily, her small arms tightening around Madison's neck. "Just for a walk, baby. We'll find somewhere pretty to sit." Madison had been thinking about this moment for days. She'd overheard Trevor talking on the phone to his drinking buddies, complaining about having to feed other people's mistakes. She'd seen her mother cry silently while washing dishes, believing no one was watching. And she'd made a decision that seemed logical in her 7-year-old mind. If they weren't wanted, if they were just burdens making everyone miserable, then maybe everyone would be happier without them. The Pier 70 walkway stretched out over Elliott Bay, offering a perfect view of the gray-green waters that extended to the horizon. Madison had always found the water peaceful, especially when the city noise faded into a gentle hum behind them. Tourist season was over, leaving the pier mostly empty except for a few joggers and dog walkers. "It's pretty here," Grace observed, now fully awake and taking in their surroundings. "Yeah, it is." Madison found a bench near the railing and carefully adjusted Grace in the sling so they could both see the water. "Gracie, do you remember Mama's phone?" The little girl nodded. "The one that makes beep beep sounds?" "That's right. And do you remember Trevor's number? The one Mama calls when she's at work?" Grace scrunched up her face in concentration. Despite being only 3, she had a remarkable memory for numbers and songs. 606? 888-4411? Perfect, baby. You're so smart. Madison pulled out their mother's old flip phone, which Rebecca had forgotten on the kitchen counter in her rush to leave for her morning shift at the diner. "I need to make a very important phone call, okay? But I need you to be really quiet." Grace nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity in her sister's voice. Madison's small fingers dialed the number with careful precision. This would be her gift to their family, removing the burden that Trevor constantly complained about. She'd seen enough movies to know that sometimes people had to make hard choices to help the people they loved. And if Trevor was happier without them around, maybe he'd be nicer to their mother. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Come on," Madison whispered, her heart pounding. "Pick up, pick up." On the 4th ring, someone answered. Daniel Morrison. The voice was different, deeper, more refined than Trevor's gravelly tone. Madison hesitated for a moment, confusion flickering across her young features. This didn't sound like Trevor at all. Hello?" she said quietly, glancing at Grace, who was watching her with wide, curious eyes. 40 miles away in the executive boardroom of Morrison Industries, Daniel Morrison paused mid-sentence during his quarterly presentation. The voice on the other end of his personal line was so small, so fragile, that every protective instinct he didn't know he possessed suddenly roared to life. "Hello there," he said gently, stepping away from the conference table filled with suited executives. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Madison's breath caught. No adult had called her sweetheart in months. Trevor's pet names for her ranged from kid to things she preferred not to remember. I was trying to call my daddy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you don't sound like him." Daniel's heart clenched at the uncertainty in her tone. He'd been expecting a call from his lawyer about the Vancouver acquisition, not this. "What's your daddy's name, honey?" Trevor Banks. He lives with us and Mama, but..." Madison paused, trying to find the right words. "He doesn't want us anymore. He says we're too much trouble, and Mama cries all the time. And I thought if we weren't here anymore, maybe everyone would be happier." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He sank into his leather chair, completely forgetting about the room full of executives waiting for him to return. Something about this little voice, about the casual way she mentioned not being there anymore, sent ice through his veins. "Sweetheart, where are you right now?" "At the pretty place with the water. There's boats and seagulls, and Grace is with me." Madison looked out over Elliott Bay, where the morning sun was creating sparkles on the waves. "I wanted to call and say goodbye, so Trevor would know he doesn't have to worry about us anymore." Daniel's breath caught. Goodbye. This child was calling to say goodbye. "Madison." The name slipped out before he could stop it, and he heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end. "How do you know my name? Who are you?" Daniel closed his eyes, his mind racing through possibilities that seemed impossible, yet felt undeniably true. Madison, 7 years old, a mother who cried all the time. A man named Trevor who wasn't her father. 8 years ago there had been Rebecca. Beautiful, vibrant Rebecca with her golden hair and infectious laugh. They'd met at a charity gala, and for 6 months, she'd been the light in his driven, work-obsessed world. But when his company went through a hostile takeover attempt, when 16-hour days became the norm and he started missing more dates than he kept, she'd left. He'd found her note on a Tuesday morning. She couldn't compete with his ambition, she said. She deserved someone who could put her first. He'd tried to find her afterward when the dust settled and he realized what he'd lost. But Rebecca Miller had vanished from Seattle as if she'd never existed. No forwarding address, no mutual friends, nothing. "Madison," he said again, softer this time. "What's your mama's name?" "Rebecca. Rebecca Millerbanks now, I think. She married Trevor last year, but he doesn't like us very much." Madison's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather rather than a desperate situation. Rebecca. Daniel's hands were shaking now, something that hadn't happened since his first board meeting 15 years ago. "Madison, listen to me very carefully. I need you to stay exactly where you are, okay? Don't move, don't hang up, just keep talking to me." "But I already said goodbye. That was supposed to be the last—" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he softened his tone immediately. "No, sweetheart, you're not saying goodbye to anyone today. Tell me about Grace." "Is she your sister?" Madison nodded, then remembered he couldn't see her. "Yes, she's 3 and she's really smart. She knows all her numbers and some letters, and she sings really pretty songs. She's sleeping on me right now in the purple sling." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. A 3-year-old sister. Rebecca had moved on, built a life with someone else, had another child. But Madison might be his. "You said Trevor isn't your real daddy. Do you know who your real father is?" Madison was quiet for a long moment. "Mama doesn't talk about him. Sometimes I see her looking at old pictures when she thinks I'm asleep and she looks sad. But when I ask, she just says he was someone who loved his work more than people." The description hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. How many times had Rebecca said exactly those words during their fights? How many times had she accused him of loving Morrison Industries more than her? "Madison, what do you look like, sweetheart?" "I have yellow hair like Mama and blue eyes. Grace looks different. She has brown hair like Trevor. People always say I look like Mama's twin, just smaller." Daniel closed his eyes, remembering Rebecca's blonde hair spilling across his pillow on Sunday mornings, her blue eyes sparkling with laughter when she caught him working on his laptop during their weekend getaways. "Listen to me, Madison. I need you to promise me something very important. Can you do that?" "I guess so." "Promise me you won't go anywhere near the water. Promise me you'll stay on the bench with Grace and keep talking to me until I get there." "Until you get where?" "You don't even know where I am." Daniel was already standing, grabbing his car keys from his desk drawer. Pier 70 overlooking Elliott Bay. "There's a bench near the railing where little girls with blonde hair sometimes sit when they need to think." Madison gasped. "How did you know that?" "Because I know a lot of things about you that you don't know yet, sweetheart. And we have a lot to talk about. But first, I need to make sure you and Grace are safe. Can you do that for me?" For the first time since the phone call began, Madison felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Are you really coming to see us?" Madison asked, and Daniel could hear the disbelief in her young voice. It broke his heart to realize that this child was surprised by the concept of an adult actually following through on a promise. "I'm in my car right now," Daniel assured her, weaving through downtown Seattle traffic with a desperation he'd never felt before. "It should take me about 20 minutes to get to you. Will you stay on the phone with me?" "Okay." Madison looked down at Grace, who had dozed off again in the warm morning sun. "But I don't understand why you want to help us. Most grown-ups don't like kids very much." The casual way she said it made Daniel's chest tight. "Some grown-ups are just scared, sweetheart. They don't know how to show they care. But that doesn't mean they don't want to help. Trevor says kids are expensive and loud and messy. He says Mama would be prettier if she wasn't always tired from taking care of us." Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. Every revelation about this Trevor character made him angrier, but he kept his voice gentle for Madison's sake. "What do you think about that?" Madison was quiet for a moment, swinging her legs from the bench. "I think Trevor doesn't understand that families are supposed to take care of each other. Mama takes care of Grace and me, and I try to take care of Grace, and Grace makes us laugh when we're sad. But Trevor only takes care of Trevor." The wisdom in her words stunned him. At 7 years old, this little girl had a better understanding of family dynamics than many adults he knew. "You're very smart, Madison. Has anyone ever told you that?" "Mama does sometimes. She says I'm going to do amazing things when I grow up, and that I have a good heart like." Madison stopped abruptly. Like who, sweetheart? Like someone she used to know. She never says who, but she gets this look in her eyes like she's remembering something happy and sad at the same time. Daniel had to pull over for a moment, as the emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Rebecca had been pregnant when she left. She'd known and she'd left anyway, carrying his child and never telling him. The anger and hurt warred with an overwhelming need to protect these two little girls who were sitting alone on a pier, contemplating solutions that no child should ever have to consider. Madison, can you tell me more about your mama? What's she like? She's beautiful, and she works really hard, and she always makes sure Grace and I have something to eat even if she doesn't. She sings songs when she thinks we're asleep, and she never yells at us, even when we make mistakes. She smells like the lavender soap from the dollar store, and she gives the best hugs in the whole world. Daniel smiled despite everything. That was the Rebecca he remembered, generous to a fault, putting everyone else's needs before her own. She sounds wonderful. I bet she loves you and Grace very much. She does. That's why I thought, if we weren't around anymore, she could just worry about herself for once. And maybe Trevor would be nicer to her if it was just them. Oh, sweetheart. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. Love isn't a pie where there's less for everyone when more people need it. Your mama loves you because you're you, not because she has to. And anyone who can't see how special you are doesn't deserve to be part of your family. Madison was quiet for a long time, processing this. In her 7 years of life, no adult had ever spoken to her this way, like her thoughts and feelings actually mattered, like she was worth listening to. Trevor barely acknowledged her existence except to complain about noise or mess, and even the teachers at school, when she'd been able to attend regularly, treated her more like a problem to be managed than a person to be understood. Can I tell you a secret? Madison asked suddenly. Of course, sweetheart. I'd be honored if you shared a secret with me. Sometimes I pretend I have a different daddy. A daddy who comes home from work and asks about my day, and who helps me with homework, and who reads me stories before bed. I know it's silly because I'm too old for bedtime stories, but in my pretend world, my daddy doesn't think I'm too old for anything. Daniel's heart shattered completely. Madison, that's not silly at all, and you're definitely not too old for bedtime stories. I'm 40 years old and I still love stories. Really? Really? What kind of stories do you like? I like stories about families who love each other and about kids who go on adventures, and about magic that makes sad things better. Mama used to tell me stories, but she's too tired now. She falls asleep as soon as her head hits the pillow. Daniel made another mental note. Rebecca was clearly exhausted beyond measure. Working multiple jobs while caring for 2 small children and dealing with an abusive partner would drain anyone. Madison, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that? I think so. When you called this morning, when you said you wanted to say goodbye, what exactly were you planning to do? Madison was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was very small. I wasn't really going to do anything bad. I'm not brave enough for that. But I thought if I called and said we were going away forever, maybe Trevor would realize that losing us would make Mama sad. And then he'd understand that he should be nicer to us. So it was more like a wake-up call. Yeah. Except I thought Trevor would answer, and I'd tell him we were leaving and he'd get scared and promise to be better. I've seen it in movies. Someone almost loses the people they love and then they change. Daniel closed his eyes, marveling at the complex emotional intelligence of this 7-year-old. She'd been trying to manipulate a grown man into treating her family better, using the only leverage she thought she had, the threat of loss. But movies aren't always like real life, are they? Daniel said gently. No. In real life, sometimes people don't change even when they should. Sometimes they just get madder. You're absolutely right about that. Madison, can I tell you something? Yes. You are one of the smartest, bravest, most caring people I've ever met. The fact that you were trying to protect your mama and your sister, even in a scary situation, tells me everything I need to know about who you are inside. Madison felt warm all over, like she'd been wrapped in the softest blanket in the world. Are you married? Do you have kids? The question caught him off guard. No, I'm not married. and I don't have any children that I knew about until today. Something in his tone made Madison sit up straighter. What do you mean? Daniel took a deep breath. This wasn't how he'd planned to have this conversation, but nothing about this day was going according to plan. Madison, I think there's a chance that I might be your real father. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Daniel worried she'd hung up. Madison, are you still there? I'm here, she whispered. But that's impossible. Mama said my daddy didn't want us. Your mama was wrong, sweetheart. If I'm your father, and I think I am, then I didn't know about you. I would never have left if I'd known. But how can you be my daddy if you've never even seen me? Daniel could see the pier in the distance now, his heart pounding as he searched for a small blonde figure on a bench. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're scared or confused. Your mama and we had some problems a long time ago, and she left before I could fix them. I think she was carrying you when she left, but she never told me. So you really didn't know about me and Grace? Grace isn't my daughter, sweetheart. She's your half-sister, but you. I think you might be mine. Madison watched a seagull land on the railing near them, its white feathers bright against the gray sky. The bird seemed completely unafraid, confident in its place in the world. Madison had never felt that kind of confidence about anything. If you're my real daddy, does that mean you want us? Like actually want us around? The heartbreak in her question nearly undid him completely. Madison, if you're my daughter, then you're the most important thing in the world to me. And Grace is important too, because she's important to you. Even though we don't have nice clothes or live in a nice place, especially because of that. Nobody should have to live the way you've been living. Madison was quiet for a moment, watching Grace sleep peacefully in the purple sling. Her little sister had never known any life other than this one. Constant worry, never enough food, always having to be quiet so Trevor wouldn't get angry. But Madison remembered dimly a time before Trevor, when Mama smiled more and laughed sometimes, when there were occasional trips to the park and ice cream cones on special days. Can I ask you what you do for work? Madison said suddenly. I run a company. We build things, buildings, bridges, places where people live and work. Like the big glass building downtown? The really tall one with all the windows? Daniel smiled. That's one of ours, yes. I like that building. Sometimes when Mama takes us on the bus, I count all the windows and try to imagine what it would be like to see the whole city from up there. Would you like to see it sometime? The view from the top, I mean? Madison's breath caught. Could we really do that? If you want to. There's a restaurant up there and the windows go all the way around so you can see everything. The mountains, the water, the whole city spread out like a map. Grace would love that. She likes to look at things from high places. Sometimes I put her on my shoulders so she can see over fences and stuff. The casual way Madison mentioned carrying her 3-year-old sister around the city made Daniel's chest tight. This little girl had been forced to grow up far too fast, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to the adults in her life. Madison, can I ask you something else? Sure. What do you want to be when you grow up? Madison had never been asked this question by an adult who seemed genuinely interested in her answer. Teachers asked it sometimes, but in that automatic way that meant they expected simple answers like teacher or doctor. This man, this possible father, sounded like he really wanted to know. I want to help people, she said slowly. I want to make sure kids don't have to be scared in their own houses, and that mamas don't have to work so hard they cry from being tired. I don't know what job does that, but that's what I want to do. Daniel had to stop walking for a moment, overwhelmed by the profound compassion in his daughter's voice. At 7 years old, living in poverty and dealing with an abusive stepfather, she was thinking about how to help other people in similar situations. That's a beautiful dream, Madison. And there are lots of jobs that help people: social workers, counselors, lawyers who work with families, people who run organizations that help kids and families in trouble. Really? People get paid to help other people? The best people do. And you know what? I think you'd be amazing at any of those jobs. Madison felt something she'd never experienced before. The sensation of an adult believing in her potential, seeing her as someone who could grow up to do meaningful things. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. Could we really do that? Madison asked. Could I really help people someday? Sweetheart, you're already helping people. You help your mama by taking care of Grace. You help Grace by protecting her and loving her. You tried to help your whole family this morning by making a very brave phone call. You're already exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. Madison could see a black car pulling into the pier parking lot, and her heart started beating faster. There's a fancy car here, is that you? Probably. I'm looking for a little girl with blonde hair and a pink shirt, sitting with an even littler girl with brown hair. Madison looked down at her faded pink t-shirt, one of the few that still fit her properly. That's us. Daniel parked the car and stepped out, his eyes immediately finding the small figure on the bench. Even from a distance, even after 8 years, he could see Rebecca in every line of her face. But there was something else there too, something that was purely Madison. A strength that reminded him of his own determination, a gentleness that was all her own. This was his daughter. He knew it with absolute certainty. I can see you, he said softly into the phone. You're beautiful, Madison, just like your mama. Madison watched as a tall man in an expensive suit walked toward them. He looked like the men in the business magazines Trevor sometimes read. Confident, successful, important. But his eyes were kind, and he moved carefully, as if he was approaching something precious that might break. She could see now that he had blonde hair like hers, though his was darker and styled neatly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and when he smiled, she could see the same dimple in his left cheek that she saw when she looked in the mirror. Are you scared? She asked. Terrified, Daniel admitted. But not of you. I'm scared of everything you've been through and everything I missed and how to make it better. He was close enough now that she could see the tears in his eyes, and somehow that made her trust him more than any words could have. Trevor never cried, never showed any emotion except anger or indifference. But this man, her possible father, wasn't ashamed to cry over meeting her. Are you going to sit down? Madison asked, patting the bench beside her. May I? The fact that he asked permission, that he didn't just assume he had the right to her space, made Madison nod eagerly. Daniel sat down carefully, maintaining enough distance that she wouldn't feel crowded but close enough that she could see his face clearly. Hi, he said simply. Hi, Madison replied, suddenly shy. Grace stirred in the sling and opened her eyes, taking in the sight of the stranger with curious brown eyes. You must be Grace, Daniel said gently. I'm Daniel. I'm a friend of your sister's. Grace studied his face with the frank assessment of a 3-year-old. You look like Maddie, she announced. Madison and Daniel exchanged glances, and Madison felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Do you think so? Daniel asked Grace seriously. Uh-huh. Same yellow hair, same eyes, same. Grace pointed at Daniel's left cheek. Same little dent when you smile. That's called a dimple, Madison told her sister softly. Dimple, Grace repeated solemnly. Maddie has a dimple too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the boats move across the harbor. A ferry was making its way toward Bainbridge Island, carrying commuters and tourists away from the city. Madison had always wondered what it would be like to be on one of those boats, going somewhere new, somewhere better. Madison, Daniel said quietly, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say is okay. There's no wrong answer. Okay. If it turns out that I really am your father, how would you feel about that? Madison considered the question seriously. I think I'd feel happy, and scared, and maybe a little mad. Mad? Why mad? Because if you're my real daddy, that means you've been somewhere else my whole life while Mama and Grace and I have been by ourselves. Even if you didn't know about us, it still feels sad that we missed so much time. Daniel nodded, appreciating her honesty. You're absolutely right to feel that way. If I am your father, then we've lost 7 years that we can't get back. That is sad, and it's okay to be mad about it. But, Madison continued, I think I'd also feel hopeful, because maybe now we could have the time that's left. We could have all the time that's left, Daniel confirmed, and I'd want to make every day count. Grace had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that children bring to discussions they sense are important, even if they don't fully understand them. "Are you Maddie's daddy?" she asked Daniel directly. "I think I might be, Grace. What do you think about that?" Grace considered this gravely. "If you're Maddie's daddy, are you going to be nice to her?" "Very nice, the nicest I can possibly be." "And are you going to give her food and toys and not yell?" "Lots of food, definitely some toys, and absolutely no yelling." Grace nodded her approval. "Good. Maddie deserves nice things." Madison felt tears prick her eyes at her sister's simple declaration. Even at 3 years old, Grace understood that Madison had been shouldering burdens no child should carry. "You deserve nice things too, Grace," Daniel said softly. "Both of you do." "Hi, Daddy," Madison said quietly, testing out the word she'd never been able to say with any real meaning before. Daniel Morrison, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, felt his careful composure crumble completely. He sat down on a pier bench and cried for the first time in 20 years, while his daughter, his brave, brilliant, beautiful daughter, reached over and patted his hand with the natural compassion that seemed to define everything about her. "It's okay," Madison told him gently. "Sometimes crying helps. Mama taught me that." And for the first time in 8 years, Daniel began to believe that maybe, just maybe, some mistakes could be forgiven, some wounds could heal, and some families could find their way back to each other. Daniel sat beside Madison on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance while Grace slept peacefully between them. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Madison had his determined jawline beneath Rebecca's delicate features, and when she concentrated, she got the same little wrinkle between her eyebrows that he saw in the mirror every morning. "Can I ask you something?" Madison said, her small hand nervously playing with the frayed edge of Grace's purple sling. "Anything, sweetheart. If you're really my daddy, why haven't you come to see us before? Mama's been sad for a really long time." Daniel felt the weight of 8 lost years settle on his shoulders. "Because I didn't know where you were. When your mama left, she didn't tell me where she was going. I tried to find her, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes when people are hurt, they hide so well that even people who love them can't find them." Madison considered this. "Mama hides when Trevor yells. She goes in the bathroom and runs the water so we can't hear her crying." The casual way she mentioned this made Daniel's hands clench into fists. "How often does Trevor yell?" "Every day, I think. He gets mad about everything. The food, the noise, the bills, the way Mama looks when she's tired. Yesterday, he threw his plate because Mama made spaghetti again, and she had to clean it up while Grace and I hid under the table." Daniel closed his eyes, struggling to contain his rage. "Madison, has Trevor ever hurt you or Grace? Has he ever hit you?" Madison shook her head quickly. "No, he just yells. Mama says he's frustrated because he can't find a job, but—" She looked out over the water. "I don't think that's why he's mean. I think he just likes being mean sometimes. You're probably right about that, sweetheart. Some people choose to be angry because it's easier than being sad or scared." Grace stirred in the sling, her brown eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Daniel with the frank curiosity of a 3-year-old, showing no fear of the stranger sitting beside her sister. "Hi there, Grace," Daniel said softly. "I'm Daniel. I'm a friend of your sister's." Grace studied his face seriously. "You have kind eyes. Like the nice lady at the food place." "What food place is that?" Madison's cheeks flushed pink. "The food bank. Mama takes us there sometimes when Trevor eats all the groceries before we get home. Grace likes Mrs. Chen. She always saves the good fruit for us." Daniel made a mental note to make a substantial donation to whatever food bank they'd been visiting. The idea of his daughter having to depend on charity while he had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes made him physically ill. "Madison, I need to ask you something important. Where is your mama right now?" "She's working at the diner until 3 o'clock. Then she has to clean the office building tonight. She won't be home until really late." "And Trevor?" Madison shrugged. "Probably still on the couch. He doesn't wake up until after lunch most days." Daniel checked his watch. It was almost noon. "Would you like to see where your daddy works?" The word felt strange on his tongue, but also perfectly right. Madison's eyes widened. Really? We can do that? If you want to. I have an office building downtown with a view almost as pretty as this one, and there's a cafeteria with really good food. Grace perked up at the mention of food. Good food? Like the kind that comes in boxes instead of cans? The innocent question broke Daniel's heart all over again. Yes, sweetheart. All kinds of good food. Can we really? Madison asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time that day. Of course. But first I need to call your mama and let her know you're safe. Can you give me the number where she works? Madison recited the diner's number from memory, and Daniel dialed it on his phone. When a harried voice answered with, Pete's Diner, how can I help you? He asked to speak with Rebecca Miller Banks. Becky, hold on, let me grab her. Becky, phone. The wait seemed eternal, but finally he heard a voice that sent him tumbling back 8 years. Hello, this is Rebecca. Her voice was tired, worn thin by years of struggle, but it was still unmistakably her. Daniel had to clear his throat before he could speak. Rebecca, this is Daniel Morrison. I have Madison and Grace with me and they're safe. The silence on the other end was so complete he thought the line had gone dead. Rebecca, are you there? Daniel? Her voice was barely a whisper. That's impossible. How did you? Madison, is she okay? Oh God, where did you find her? I came home for lunch and she was gone, and Trevor said she probably just wandered off. But she never does that. Never. And I've been calling everywhere. Rebecca, breathe. They're both fine. Madison called Trevor's phone this morning, but I answered instead. We need to talk. I don't understand. Why would you have Trevor's phone? Daniel realized she didn't know. Somehow in 8 years, Rebecca had never discovered that Trevor had been using Daniel's old number. When Daniel had upgraded to a new business line 2 years ago and given up his personal number, the phone company had eventually reassigned it. Trevor, desperate for any phone service after his credit was destroyed, had taken whatever number was available through a prepaid service that had acquired the recycled number. It's a long story. But Rebecca, I need you to know. I never knew about Madison. If I had known. Don't. Her voice was sharp now, protective. Don't you dare. You made your choice 8 years ago. You chose your company over everything else. I chose wrong, Daniel said simply. But I didn't choose to abandon my daughter because I didn't know she existed. Madison was watching his face intently, picking up on the tension in his voice. Daniel forced himself to smile at her, running a gentle hand over her blonde hair. We need to meet, he continued. All of us. There's a lot to figure out. I can't just leave work, Daniel. I need this job. When does your shift end? 3 o'clock, but then I have to. Can you meet us at Morrison Industries at 3:30? The big glass building on 5th Avenue. Security will bring you up to the 42nd floor. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Morrison Industries. You really did it. You built your empire. None of it matters without you. Without her. Daniel looked at Madison, who was now helping Grace pick seashells from the spaces between the bench slats. Rebecca, please just give me a chance to explain. Fine, 3:30. But Daniel, don't you dare hurt her. She's been through enough. The line went dead, and Daniel stared at his phone for a moment before turning back to Madison. Was that Mama? Madison asked. Is she mad at us for leaving? No, sweetheart, she's not mad. She's just worried because she loves you. We're going to see her this afternoon. Grace looked up from her seashell collection. Will there be food at your workplace? Daniel laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had all day. Yes, Grace. All the food you can eat. As they walked back to his car, Madison slipped her small hand into his larger one. Daddy? She said experimentally. Yes? Thank you for coming to find us. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for calling, sweetheart. You saved us all today. The executive dining room at Morrison Industries had never hosted guests quite like Madison and Grace. Daniel watched as Grace carefully examined each item on her plate. Grilled chicken, fresh vegetables, real mashed potatoes with butter, as if she couldn't quite believe it was all for her. It's really good, Madison said, though she was eating slowly, savoring each bite. Grace, try the green beans. They taste different when they're not from a can. Better different or worse different? Grace asked seriously. Much better different. Daniel had barely touched his own food, too fascinated by watching his daughters navigate a world he'd taken for granted his entire life. Every small reaction, Madison's surprise at the cloth napkins, Grace's delight at the ice water with lemon slices, reminded him of the vast gulf between his life and theirs. Mr. Morrison. His assistant, Janet, appeared in the doorway. Ms. Miller-Banks is here. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. Send her up, please. Madison looked up from her plate, suddenly nervous. Is Mama going to be mad that we left? Maybe a little, Daniel admitted, but not at you. She'll be mad at the situation, not at her girls. When Rebecca appeared in the doorway, Daniel felt the same jolt of recognition he'd experienced on the phone, magnified 1,000-fold. 8 years had changed her. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her figure was thinner, worn down by stress and insufficient food. But she was still beautiful, still the woman who had made him believe in love before he'd thrown it all away for quarterly reports and board meetings. Mama! Madison jumped up and ran to her mother, who caught her in a fierce embrace. Oh, baby, I was so scared. Why did you leave like that? I'm sorry, Mama. I thought if Grace and I weren't around anymore, maybe Trevor would be nicer to you. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she held Madison tighter. Oh, sweetheart. You should never have to think about things like that. That's not your job. Grace had climbed down from her chair and was tugging on Rebecca's worn uniform skirt. Mama, up. Food good here. Rebecca lifted Grace with one arm while keeping the other around Madison, her eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time. The impact was like touching a live wire. Hello, Rebecca. Daniel. Her voice was carefully neutral, but he could see the storm of emotions in her blue eyes. Thank you for taking care of them. They're incredible kids. You've done an amazing job with them. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. Right. Such a good job that my 7-year-old thought the solution to our problems was for her and her sister to disappear. That's not your fault. That's the fault of someone who made them feel unwanted. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Don't you dare judge my choices, Daniel. You have no idea what I've been through. You're right, I don't, but I'd like to understand. Madison looked back and forth between her parents, sensing the tension. Mama, are you mad at Daddy? Daddy? Rebecca's voice cracked on the word. Daniel stepped forward carefully. Rebecca, Madison is mine. I can see it, you can see it, and more than that. She called Trevor's number this morning, but somehow the call came to me instead. Don't you think that's more than coincidence? Rebecca sank into one of the leather chairs, still holding Grace. I don't know what to think anymore. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel asked quietly. When you found out you were pregnant, why didn't you tell me? Because you made it very clear that your work was more important than anything else. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. I was competing with board meetings and conference calls and business trips. I would make dinner plans and you'd cancel at the last minute. I'd try to talk to you about us, about our future, and you'd be checking your email over my shoulder. Daniel felt the truth of her words like physical blows. I know. I was an idiot. You were 28 years old and obsessed with proving yourself. And I was 26 and tired of feeling like an afterthought. So when I found out I was pregnant, Rebecca looked down at Madison, who was listening intently. I convinced myself you'd see it as another distraction from your precious company. You were wrong. Was I? Really? Be honest, Daniel. If I had told you I was pregnant 8 years ago, what would you have done? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, forcing himself to consider the question honestly. 28-year-old Daniel, driven by ambition, and terrified of anything that threatened his climb to success. I don't know, he admitted finally. I'd like to think I would have done the right thing, but you're right. I was different then. Selfish. But Rebecca, I changed. After you left, when I realized what I'd lost. You built a bigger company. I built a monument to my own stupidity. Do you know what the name Morrison Industries actually means to me? It means the thing I chose over love. It means the biggest mistake I ever made. Rebecca stared at him, searching his face for deception and finding none. I looked for you, Daniel continued, for months after you left. I hired private investigators. I called every mutual friend we had. You vanished completely. I had to. I couldn't risk you finding me and trying to convince me to come back just because of the baby. I needed to know that if we were ever together again, it would be because you actually wanted me, not because you felt obligated. And then you met Trevor. Rebecca's face darkened. Trevor was safe. He wasn't going anywhere, wasn't building an empire, wasn't going to choose work over family. At least that's what I thought. What happened? Madison was still listening, and Rebecca glanced at her daughter before speaking carefully. People aren't always who they pretend to be. Trevor was charming when he was trying to win me over. Attentive, good with Madison, romantic. It wasn't until after we were married that I realized he thought being a husband meant being taken care of, not taking care of others. He doesn't work. He doesn't do anything. He sleeps until noon, drinks beer, and complains about everything. And Madison, Rebecca's voice broke. He treats her like she's an inconvenience. Like she's not even part of the family. But Grace is his daughter. Yes, and he loves her when it's convenient. When she's not crying or hungry or in need of attention. But Madison gets the worst of it because she's not his, and he never lets any of us forget it. Daniel felt rage building in his chest again. Why do you stay? Because I have 2 children and 3 part-time jobs that barely pay for rent and groceries. Because in this city, a single mother with no degree and no family support doesn't have many options. Rebecca's voice rose, then she caught herself and looked at the girls apologetically. You have options now, Daniel said quietly. What's that supposed to mean? It means you don't have to go back to him. It means Madison and Grace don't have to live in a place where they're not wanted. It means we can figure this out together. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment. You want us back just like that. Just like that. Because of Madison. Because of all of you. Because I spent 8 years regretting the biggest mistake of my life, and now I have a chance to fix it. And if I say no, then I respect your decision. But I'm still going to make sure Madison and Grace are safe and cared for. They're part of my life now, Rebecca. I won't walk away from them, Madison had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up in her small, clear voice. Mama, can I ask you something? Of course, baby. Are you happy with Trevor? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Rebecca couldn't deflect it. No, sweetheart, I'm not. Are you scared to leave him? Rebecca looked at her 7-year-old daughter, amazed by her perceptiveness. A little bit. Change is scary, even when staying is scarier. Madison climbed into Rebecca's lap, careful not to disturb Grace. Maybe scared is okay if it means we get to be happy again. Like how I was scared to call Daddy, but it turned out to be the best thing ever. Rebecca looked at Daniel over Madison's head, seeing something in his eyes that had never been there before. A depth of emotion. A groundedness that the driven young man she'd once known had lacked. What are you suggesting? She asked quietly. Come home with me. All of you. Tonight. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Daniel, I can't just... Yes, you can. You're tired, Rebecca. You've been fighting alone for 8 years and you don't have to anymore. But what about Trevor? What about my jobs? What about... Let me worry about Trevor. As for your jobs... Daniel smiled slightly. I think we can find you something better. Grace, who had been dozing in Rebecca's arms, suddenly perked up. Are we going to live in the pretty building? How would you feel about that, Grace? Daniel asked. Good. Food here is much better, and no more yelling people. Madison looked up at her mother with hope shining in her blue eyes. Please, Mama. I want to try being a family with Daddy. Rebecca felt the last of her resistance crumble. For 8 years she'd been strong for her daughters, made the hard choices, sacrificed her own happiness for their security. Maybe it was time to take a chance on joy. Okay, she whispered. Okay, let's try, whispered. Okay. 1 year later, the autumn sun was setting over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Madison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the same waters where she'd once contemplated saying goodbye to the world. Now, at 8 years old, she could barely remember feeling that hopeless. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks had been a delicate dance of adjustment, with Madison testing boundaries she'd never been allowed to have, Grace adapting to a world where food was abundant and voices stayed gentle, and Rebecca learning to trust that this second chance was real. Daniel had surprised them all with his patience. The successful CEO who had once lived for quarterly reports and board meetings now scheduled his most important meetings around school pickup times and bedtime stories. He'd converted one of his spare offices into a homework room, complete with child-sized desks and shelves full of books that Madison devoured with the hunger of someone who'd been starved for stories. "Maddie, come help me with the surprise," Grace called from the kitchen, where she was carefully arranging flowers in a vase with the focused determination that only a 4-year-old could muster. The penthouse had become home in ways Madison had never expected. Not because of the luxury, though she had to admit she loved the hot water that never ran out and the refrigerator that was always full, but because of the laughter that filled it daily. Real laughter, not the nervous giggles that had punctuated her childhood when she and Grace tried to lighten Mama's mood after particularly difficult days with Trevor. The first month had been the hardest. Madison had woken up every morning expecting to find herself back in the cramped studio apartment, expecting Trevor's angry voice to shatter the peace. She'd hoarded food in her backpack until Daniel gently explained that there would always be enough, and she'd jumped at every raised voice until she learned that passionate discussions about business were different from the cruel tirades she'd grown used to. Grace had adapted more quickly, as children often do. Within weeks, she was chattering away to Daniel as if she'd known him her whole life, showing him her drawings and insisting he read her favorite books with all the different voices for each character. She'd started calling him Daddy Daniel without any prompting, as if her 3-year-old mind had simply accepted that this was how families were supposed to work. But it was Rebecca's transformation that had been the most remarkable to witness. The exhausted, defeated woman who had walked into Morrison Industries a year ago had gradually been replaced by someone Madison barely recognized, her mother, as she was meant to be. Rebecca laughed now, really laughed, throwing her head back and letting joy bubble up from somewhere deep inside. She'd started taking art classes in the evenings, something she'd dreamed of doing before life got in the way. Her paintings now decorated the penthouse walls, watercolors of the city skyline, the harbor, and countless portraits of her daughters. "What kind of surprise?" Madison asked, though she suspected she knew. Today marked the first anniversary of what their family privately called phone call day, the day their lives had changed forever. "The good kind," Grace giggled, her brown hair escaping from the ponytail Rebecca had attempted that morning. She'd grown inches in the past year, her face losing some of its baby roundness, but she still approached everything with the same joyful curiosity. The changes in Madison had been more subtle but no less profound. She stood taller now, spoke up in class, made friends with the confidence of a child who knew she was valued at home. Her grades had skyrocketed once she'd started attending school regularly, and her teachers constantly remarked on her exceptional empathy and leadership skills. She was already talking about wanting to study child psychology when she grew up, her early experiences having crystallized into a desire to help other children navigate difficult situations. "Has anyone seen your father?" Rebecca asked, emerging from the master bedroom wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes that sparkled now in a way they hadn't for years. Rebecca had struggled the most with accepting their new reality. Years of making do with less, of constantly worrying about money, of putting everyone else's needs first, had left her almost unable to receive care without feeling guilty. Daniel had been endlessly patient, slowly convincing her that she deserved happiness, that accepting his love and support wasn't charity but partnership. Their relationship had been rebuilt on entirely different foundations than their first romance. Where their young love had been passionate but unstable, this was steady and deep. They'd learned to communicate, to prioritize each other and their family, to see challenges as problems to solve together rather than obstacles that drove them apart. "Conference call with Tokyo," Madison replied, but he said he'd be done by 6. Daniel's work habits had been perhaps the most dramatic change of all. The man who had once lived at the office now rarely worked past 6 p.m. He'd restructured Morrison Industries around the revolutionary concept that a balanced leadership team was more effective than one exhausted CEO trying to micromanage everything. His company was actually more profitable now, his employees happier, his board members initially skeptical but ultimately impressed by the results. Perfect timing then. Rebecca checked her watch. The surprise guests should be arriving any minute. Madison's stomach clenched with old anxiety. Surprise guests had never been good news in her previous life, but this was different. She could tell by the sparkle in her mother's eyes the way Grace was practically bouncing with excitement. Before Madison could ask what she meant, the elevator chimed. The doors opened to reveal Trevor Banks, flanked by 2 police officers. Madison's blood ran cold, and she instinctively stepped in front of Grace. But Rebecca put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart, this is just closure." Trevor looked terrible. A year of unemployment and increasing alcohol dependency had taken its toll. His clothes were wrinkled, his face was unshaven, and his eyes held the wild desperation of someone who'd run out of options. The year had not been kind to him. Without Rebecca's income and care, his life had spiraled completely out of control. "Becky," he slurred slightly, "you gotta come home. I can't do this anymore. Everything's falling apart." Looking at him now, Madison felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. This man who had loomed so large in her childhood fears looked small and broken. She realized that his cruelty had never really been about them. It had been about his own failures, his own inability to cope with life's challenges. "I am home, Trevor," Rebecca said calmly. "This is my home. These are my daughters. This is my family." "That's not your family. I'm your husband. Grace is my daughter." One of the officers stepped forward. "Mr. Banks, you were told this was just to retrieve your personal belongings and finalize the custody arrangement. Any harassment will result in immediate arrest." Daniel appeared from his office, moving to stand protectively near his family. His presence seemed to deflate Trevor somewhat. The contrast between the 2 men was stark and undeniable. Where Daniel radiated quiet confidence and genuine care for his family, Trevor seemed to carry his failures like a weight that was slowly crushing him. "So this is him," Trevor sneered, but there was no real venom in it anymore, just the bitter resignation of a man who knew he'd lost everything that mattered. "The rich prince who swooped in and stole my family." "I didn't steal anything," Daniel replied evenly. "I just gave them what they deserved: love, respect, and security." The words hit Trevor like physical blows. He knew they were true. He'd had everything: a beautiful wife, 2 children who could have loved him, a chance at happiness, and he'd thrown it all away through his own selfishness and inability to grow up. "You can't just take Grace, she's my daughter." "And she always will be," Rebecca said firmly. "But Trevor, you haven't seen her in 6 months. You haven't called, haven't asked how she's doing, haven't paid a penny in support. You only remembered you had a daughter when you realized I wasn't coming back." It was true, and they all knew it. After the initial shock of Rebecca leaving, Trevor had seemed almost relieved to have the responsibility removed from his shoulders. He'd spent his days drinking and feeling sorry for himself, only reaching out when the loneliness became unbearable. Grace, who had been hiding behind Madison, suddenly stepped forward with the fearless honesty of a child. "I don't want to live with you anymore, Trevor. You yell too much, and you don't like my sister." The simple statement hung in the air, devastating in its truth. Grace spoke without malice, just stating facts as she saw them. In her world, family meant people who took care of each other, who were kind, who made each other feel safe and loved. Trevor's face crumpled. Looking at Grace, really looking at her, he saw a healthy, happy child who barely remembered him. She'd grown so much in the past year, learned new words, developed her own personality, experienced joys and milestones that he'd had no part in. "Gracie, I can change. I can be better." "Maybe you can," Daniel said, and there was genuine compassion in his voice. "But not with them. They've been through enough, let them be happy." The custody papers had been finalized months ago. Trevor's parental rights to Grace hadn't been terminated, but his visitation was supervised and contingent on his sobriety, a condition he'd failed to meet consistently. Rebecca had full custody, and Daniel was in the process of adopting both girls. The legal proceedings had been more complex than anyone had anticipated. Daniel's lawyers had been thorough, ensuring that every aspect was handled properly. Trevor had initially fought the arrangements, but as his own situation deteriorated and his inability to provide a stable environment became clear, he'd gradually stopped showing up to court dates. "I want them to know about you," Rebecca told Trevor, as the officers prepared to escort him out. "Grace especially. When she's older, when you're healthier, maybe there can be a relationship, but not now. Not like this." Rebecca meant it. Despite everything Trevor had put them through, she didn't want Grace to grow up feeling abandoned by her biological father. But any future relationship would be on Grace's terms, when she was old enough to understand and choose for herself. Trevor nodded numbly, the fight going out of him completely. For a moment he looked at Grace with something approaching genuine love. Perhaps the first time he'd ever really seen her as a person rather than a burden. "Be good, Gracie," he whispered. "Be happy." Grace nodded solemnly. "I will. You be good too, Trevor." As he was led away, Grace moved to the window and waved goodbye, not cruelly, but with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children possess. She'd already moved on emotionally. Trevor was part of her past, not her future. "Will he be okay?" Madison asked quietly, surprising herself with her concern. "I hope so," Rebecca answered honestly. "People can change if they really want to, but we can't wait for them to decide they want to." Madison nodded, understanding more than most children her age about the complexities of human nature. She'd learned that adults weren't simply good or bad but complicated people making choices that affected everyone around them. The elevator chimed again, and this time the doors opened to reveal Mrs. Chen from the food bank, carrying a covered dish and beaming with joy. Behind her came Dr. Martinez, Madison's pediatrician, who had been instrumental in helping the family navigate the girls' transition to their new life. Even Janet, Daniel's assistant, appeared with a bouquet of flowers and a shy smile. "Surprise!" Grace shouted, clapping her hands. "It's a celebration." Madison felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what was happening. Rebecca and Daniel had invited all the people who had helped their family along the way, not just to celebrate the anniversary, but to acknowledge that healing happened in community, with the support of people who cared. Mrs. Chen hugged Madison tightly. "Look at you, sweetheart. You're glowing." It was true. The hollow-cheeked, anxious child who had first appeared at the food bank had been replaced by a confident, healthy 8-year-old who radiated joy from the inside out. Later that evening, after a dinner of celebration rather than stress, after Grace had been tucked into her princess-themed bedroom and Madison had finished her homework at the desk Daniel had built into her room's bay window, the adults sat on the terrace overlooking the city. The guests had left, the dishes were done, and the family had settled into the comfortable rhythms that had become their normal. Daniel was reviewing some contracts while Rebecca sketched in her art pad, and both girls were supposed to be sleeping but were actually whispering and giggling in Grace's room. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Madison hadn't made that call?" Rebecca asked, curled against Daniel's side on the outdoor sofa. "Every day," Daniel admitted. "And every day I'm grateful that she was brave enough to reach out, even when she thought she was saying goodbye." It had become their tradition to end phone call day by acknowledging how close they'd all come to missing each other entirely. If Madison had been a few minutes later, if Daniel had been in a different meeting, if any number of small circumstances had been different, they might never have found each other. "I still can't believe Trevor never realized he was using your old number." "Divine intervention," Daniel said with a smile, "the universe giving us a second chance." He'd actually looked into it more thoroughly, curious about the series of coincidences that had brought them together. The trail of how his old number had made its way to Trevor was complex, through multiple phone companies, prepaid services, and bureaucratic oversights. It really did seem like fate had intervened. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, watching the lights twinkle across Seattle. The city that had once seemed so cold and hostile now felt like home in the truest sense. "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a ready-made family? Having to deal with all the complications?" It was a question she asked periodically, not because she doubted his commitment, but because sometimes she still couldn't quite believe that someone would choose them. All the chaos and complexity that came with loving them. Daniel turned to face her fully. Rebecca, a year ago I was the richest, loneliest man in Seattle. I had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. Now I have you and Madison and Grace, and every morning I wake up grateful that my daughter was brave enough to call her daddy. She gets that from you, you know. The courage to take risks for the people she loves. She gets it from her mother, who worked 3 jobs to keep her daughters fed and safe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the city below and the ocean in the distance. The silence was different now, not the heavy quiet of exhaustion or fear, but the peaceful quiet of contentment. Daniel? I love you. Not because you saved us, not because you provide for us, but because you chose us. Every day you choose us. It was something they'd talked about extensively in the family counseling sessions Daniel had arranged. Rebecca had needed to understand that his commitment wasn't born from obligation or guilt, but from genuine love and choice. That's the easiest choice I've ever made. Inside, Madison was supposed to be sleeping, but she'd crept to her bedroom door to listen to her parents talk. It had become another tradition, checking in on the adults to make sure they were happy, to reassure herself that this wasn't all a dream that might disappear. She smiled to herself, remembering the scared little girl who had sat on a pier bench a year ago, convinced that disappearing was the only way to help her family. That little girl couldn't have imagined this life, couldn't have dreamed that asking for help would lead to such abundance of love and security. Now she knew better. Sometimes the scariest thing, reaching out, asking for help, believing you deserve love, was also the bravest thing. And sometimes when you thought you were saying goodbye, you were actually saying hello to the life you'd always dreamed of. She padded back to her bed, where her stuffed elephant, a gift from Daniel, was waiting. Tomorrow was a school day, and she was excited to tell Mrs. Patterson about the anniversary celebration. Madison had friends now, real friends who invited her to birthday parties and playdates. She was in advanced reading and had joined the school's peer mediation program, where she helped other kids resolve conflicts peacefully. Grace went to preschool and came home every day with new songs and paintings that went directly onto the refrigerator. She was learning to write her name and could count to 50. She spoke in full sentences now and had developed her own sense of humor, keeping the whole family laughing with her observations about the world. Rebecca worked part-time at a nonprofit that Daniel's company supported, doing meaningful work that utilized her intelligence and compassion instead of just her desperation. She'd found her calling in helping other families navigate crises, and her own experiences gave her a credibility and empathy that made her incredibly effective. And Daniel came home every night at 6 o'clock, helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and had never once made any of them feel like an obligation. He'd found a balance he'd never thought possible, and his family had given his success meaning beyond profit margins and market share. As Madison drifted off to sleep, she could hear her parents' soft laughter drifting in from the terrace, and she smiled. Tomorrow, maybe she'd call the number that had changed everything, just to hear her daddy answer the phone and say her name with all the love in the world. Some calls she'd learned weren't meant to say goodbye at all. Some calls were meant to say, "I'm here, I need you, I love you." And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person on the other end of the line was waiting to say the same thing back. The city sparkled below them, full of other families, other stories, other children who might be sitting on benches somewhere feeling hopeless and alone. Madison whispered a small prayer into the darkness, that those children would find their own courage to reach out, to believe they deserved better, to trust that somewhere in the world, someone was waiting to love them exactly as they were.